This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Food touches every part of our lives. It's steeped in our cultures, family histories. The dinner table has been host to some of life's most intimate conversations and life-changing decisions between world leaders. But between the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the overlooked piece of why we eat what we eat has taken center stage. News about disruptions to the global supply chain have swirled around Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. Conspiracy communities that once promoted QAnon and anti-vaccine theories have sunk their teeth into an even tastier morsel: disinformation about an ongoing food crisis.
Control the food supply, control the people. This is what's happening.
Bill Gates has
this
grown
is
up
the
a lot
truth.
of farmland.
And by 2030,
He's buying up a lot of farmland, largest farmland owner in America now.
In the latest season of the podcast Things That Go Boom, host Lacey Healy unpacks our complicated and deeply personal relationships with food. And the first episode begins with this question of how food became a lightning rod for internet conspiracies. She joins me now to break down how easy it is to fall victim and why we need real solutions to combat disinformation online. Lacey Healy, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, every podcast has a story, a reason for being. What's yours?
Oh, gosh, that's a long story. I started out in Washington, D.C., working in nuclear policy and defense policy. And I did that for quite a few years. I did a lot of op-ed writing, and I listened to a lot of podcasts. And I thought, gee, there really should be a podcast on these subjects. Why wasn't there something like Radiolab for security issues? Why wasn't there something like Planet Money for security issues? So much of what we do is tell real stories about real people who are impacted by security issues. And to do that, you really have to dig in with someone. You really have to get the whole thing. You really have to live it for 30 minutes with us. And that's what we really try to do.
If I went back and heard the first dozen or so episodes and compared to the more recent ones that I've been listening to, what would be the biggest difference? How has the show evolved over time?
Oh, gosh. Oh, it's evolved so much.
Besides being better.
I knew nothing about making radio at the time. We really were just kind of jumping in and feeling it out. But another thing that took us some time to realize is that folks are so much more up on these issues. They know about North Korea and nuclear weapons. They know there are threats out there. And we really felt that at the beginning, we had to explain every little bit. But it's not that way at all. You hear that thing all the time, like, oh, explain it like you're explaining it to your grandma. Well, that kind of reduces people to the way that we think about our grandma. We have a tendency to reduce our grandma a little bit and her understanding of the world. So we really can't think of it that way. We have to think of it like our super educated friend that we went out for a drink with at a bar, and they're already up on it. They've been listening to NPR. They've been reading, and we're just going to tell them the much deeper story that they've never heard. And so I think that is one way that our show has really evolved throughout the years that has made it better and really changed our understanding of just how to talk to people.
So let's dig in on an episode called Food, War, and the Conspiracy Supply Chain. And it's a great example because I think it really does beautifully what Things That Go Boom does best. Tell us about the episode.
So there's a lot going on in this episode. This episode is everything that you just said. It's about food war and the conspiracy supply chain. And this is sort of a personal issue for me as someone who comes from a more rural part of America. I'm from Oregon, but Oregon's sort of a weird state that is sometimes red and sometimes blue, and all of it kind of mixes together. And a lot of folks are surprised to find that Oregon's not just full of hippies, but there's a lot of hippies who really like guns there also. So
it's those mountains.
Which
side of the mountains are you on?
And the eastern half of the state is totally different. So conspiracies, to me, are so often written off as like, those are the crazy people over there, and we don't even need to engage with them. Well, I'm sorry, but January 6th happened. And so we have to, as a country, engage with the so-called conspiracy theories out there. We have to engage with the disinformation that's floating around in our ecosystem. We have to understand it better, and we have to understand the people who believe this stuff better. And we have to give them a chance to be real humans. So we started by talking to someone who believes some of these conspiracy theories. And what we learned by talking to this person is about this kernel of truth. And this kernel of truth exists in pretty much every conspiracy theory. There's something that seems like it must be right. It's so right that it can't possibly be wrong. And that's what allows folks to really engage with this. And this is one thing that makes it so dangerous. And it's one thing that makes it so easy to spread. And disinformation is so tough because there's so much evidence that you can't fact check these conspiracy theories away. And so you really have to get out in front of them. All that said, we explored this kernel of truth through some of the issues that we had over the course of the pandemic, in particular supply chain issues, and thought about it through food. There's a lot of folks out there who believe some really out there things about our food ecosystem, especially at the time when we produced this episode. And those things, a lot of them, they're based in this kernel of truth. Widespread pesticide application, the accessibility of seeds, and when taken and twisted into a story that non-experts like myself might consume, who are also really scared because we've had a tough few years and some very real supply chain issues, they can become very believable.
It is fascinating to watch some of the relationships that you're talking about play out in real time, in real life, where people will use a non-controversial fact, an uncomfortable but apparent truth, and use the proximity to that to sell increasingly implausible, increasingly outlandish things. But because it's in a set with these other things that seem right, it's almost like a confidence-building measure. I'm going to lie to you, but first I'm going to tell you some truth. And what we unfortunately call in the business your real person. You know, I can't tell you how many times a producer has said, well, find me a real person. We love a person who helps illustrate a wider set of truths. Yours is Katie, not her real name. But you also seem to know her in a way that's very 21st century. She's not your friend. She's not your neighbor. She's someone you kind of know.
That's true. She's someone who was on my Facebook timeline, had been sharing a lot of this stuff about food, a lot of these concerns about supply chain issues. And I saw the snowball of all of this information coming across my Facebook feed. And what I found really fascinating about that, actually, is that the more I engaged with it, the more Facebook showed her to me. As I engaged with her content, Facebook served me more content that was from folks who agreed with her and who I hadn't seen pop up on my timeline in years. I thought that was pretty fascinating. It really shows us what we sort of know that Facebook does.
And by clicking on these things yourself, you are only guaranteeing that you're going to get more of it, which illustrates how some of this stuff takes root and gets a head start on the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about, there used to be this really, really cool website that was called Red Feed, Blue Feed, and it would show you what your feed would look like if you engaged with a lot of Republican content versus a lot of content geared toward Democrats. And they were just completely different feeds. And this was just the news, like Facebook, the kind of news it was serving you. I don't think that still applies, but it is still a version of that, the algorithm. It's serving you things that you like. And in this case, now it's more geared toward friends. So now that we're serving folks the friends that they like to engage with, it's interesting to see that there still is this political bent in the algorithm. It's serving me the conspiracy folks if I like the conspiracy folks. And I assume if I engaged with other people, it would serve me different folks.
if you talk to enough of them, if you do the cross-hatching and you understand how these things happen, you can understand how a lot of this is an attempt to make sense of a world that is very, very complicated and very, very hard to understand. But at the foundation stone of conventional journalism was this idea that if you tell people what's actually happening, they'll understand it and that will make them less afraid. Just give them good information and then they won't believe nonsense anymore. And one thing about the digital age is that it has broadened the channel of information in such a way that there are multiple sources of the truth. And giving people good information doesn't drive out bad information. I recalled that when I was listening to your friend Katie on this episode. I thought there is no amount of straight reporting that I could ever do in the remaining years I have left in my career that would get rid of some of this stuff or at least unravel it.
Absolutely. It's really unnerving to see and to grapple with the incredible spread of mis and disinformation that is happening online today. And I often ask people, what is it that's different? This thing has existed since the beginning of time. People have been printing false pamphlets and passing them out. But even before that, word of mouth, folks were telling lies. They were telling stories. This is not something that we just started doing as humans. So why is it different? And the answer is it's different because of the internet. It's different because it is so in your face all the time. There is so much in your face all the time that it's harder and harder for folks to tell what is real and what is not. And there are tons of studies that tell us that we think that we are way better at identifying false information than we actually are. We believe it and we share it too. And we often share it with only reading the headline and not even clicking on the link or only reading the first paragraph. And so it's very hard as a journalist to think about a world in which you can impact this problem. That's true because the internet is big and it's not going away anytime soon. But that also lets a lot of social media companies, a lot of the internet itself off the hook because there is regulation that's not happening here. We have to start thinking about some of that regulation, the tougher work that has to be done to make sure that a little bit less of this stuff is spreading online because there are things that can be done and that we're not actually doing right now.
One cautionary tale you bring us in the episode when it comes to something like government having a role in pushing back against disinformation was the interview with Nina Jankowicz, who was part of the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board. It was government saying, this is getting out of control, we have to do something. And as we saw, because it was government, that was a big problem.
That's true. It's very hard for the government in our current political environment to step in and do something explicitly about disinformation. One of the things that happened in Nina's case is that the disinformation got out ahead of Nina's announcement. She was coming in to create this disinformation governance board that was supposed to coordinate various government agencies' actions, things that people are already doing. So it wasn't anything that was particularly controversial that the board itself was tasked with doing, but the name of the board, the fact that the government did not get out ahead of this disinformation that was proliferating, that they didn't make the announcement first, that they waited a little while to do this. Some of those things were sort of political messaging 101, especially the world that we're living in today, where if you don't get out ahead of those things and shape the narrative, Ukraine was a wonderful example that a lot of folks have talked about, the way that the Biden administration has gotten out in front of Russia on the narrative in Ukraine, the way that Zelensky also has gotten out ahead of the narrative inside Ukraine. And in this very connected online world that we live in, that's something that you have to do, and it's something that you can't neglect doing. And so when the disinformation took over, Nina was called every name in the book. She was really vilified in the media. for taking on this role. She was called the Minister of Truth. It really spiraled. So it's tough, but we also have a lack of preparation inside the government in many respects as it relates to getting out ahead of these things, as it relates to, they're still playing a lot of cyber and information catch up in the U.S. government. I don't think this was seen as a real problem until it was a massive problem. And so there's still a lot of work to do.
Things that go boom. Why is it called Things That Go Boom?
Things that go boom. We cover all the things that go boom or could go boom, all the bombs, but also things like climate change and health security and food security, things that can go figuratively boom as well. So not just the bombs and the big things.
Lacey Healy is the host of Things That Go Boom. The episode we've been discussing, you really should listen to. It's called Food, War, and the Conspiracy Supply Chain. And it was great to have you with us. Thanks a lot for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Lacey Healy, host of the podcast Things That Go Boom. We're going to play you a part of that first episode from Season 7 titled Food, War, and the Conspiracy Supply Chain. If you want to hear more of that episode, or the rest of the season even, check out Things That Go Boom wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like it, and we think you will, Season 8 drops in your podcast feeds July 10th. Here's Lacey.
I realized the other day, I can't actually remember the last time I sat down to eat a meal. I mean, I do sit, but with 4 kids around the dinner table, someone always needs a drink or a fork or the green plate instead of the blue plate. Pretty soon, the meal is over. I'm pretty sure I used to sit to eat. But these days, more often than not, I find myself snacking on the run, shoving whatever bits and bobs I can muster up into my face, usually while I scramble back to work in front of my computer. Then there's the late night snacking, when I should be in bed, but instead, I'm scrolling social media. That is how I ended up on the phone with Katie. That's not actually her real name. She asked for anonymity for privacy reasons. See, Katie and I have been Facebook friends for years. We have the kind of online connection where you don't really remember how you met, but through sheer internet inertia, you keep tabs on each other. Weddings, babies, graduations, and in Katie's case, her thoughts on the end of the world.
When you know their plan, everything doesn't seem so crazy. It's like, well, it actually makes sense.
Katie spends a lot of time thinking about them.
I follow David Icke. He's been studying this for 32 years, and I'm very skeptical. So everything he says, I research it, but he's been right about everything so far. Who they are, according to him, and I agree with this, is a satanic cult that have begun taking over every government on the planet.
Even outside government. She thinks that those with the most power and money in the world made a deal with the literal devil for it.
Zuckerberg never created Facebook. Gates was never a poor little pauper in his mother's basement creating Microsoft. They were given that because they're part of the cult.
Katie's been watching Icke's content for at least a decade. And lately, other personalities like Alex Jones have begun to seep in.
They're doing exactly what, the people who have studied this have said they were going to do, which is completely destroy the economy, destroy food sources, and then make us beg for their new system.
From my perch on the internet, I've witnessed Katie's anxiety grow, especially since 2020. And lately, she's been posting more about one particular concern, that our food system is being sabotaged.
Warehouses throughout the globe are being just randomly hit by airplanes, set on fire, and they're all food. It's not, toilet paper makers. It's not toy makers. It's food warehouses. I saw a video of a woman who was transporting baby formula, and they told her to kind of drive into a really remote, graveled area. And she took a video of them just taking pallets of baby food and just piling it on this graveled area, kind of in an obscure area. So they are systematically trying to make it so that we can't get food. Why? Henry Kissinger said, whoever controls food controls the world.
She's taken matters into her own hands. Now the family has backyard chickens.
because I want to make sure that my family has food.
And she buys only organic food.
Again, because I've studied pesticides, which, by the way, that's part of all of this too.
Because ultimately, Katie doesn't trust our leaders. She's scared for herself and for the people she loves. Things just feel so unstable these days that it weighs on her.
It's very difficult. I think the hardest thing is, my children. I want to make sure my children are okay. I don't want what I'm hearing is going to happen to be their life, to be their world. And so for me, fighting it every day is a good distraction. I have always fought for what's right, and it is not easy, but I just can't live with myself if I don't. And this is the biggest fight of my life.
The fight that Katie's talking about means posting links on Facebook and talking to friends and family. She warns them to prep with food and supplies. She forages dandelion greens to eat.
What I'm afraid is going to happen is that it's going to be progression. Like right now, prices are high. Poor people are really going to lose their apartments and their homes because they can't afford the food and the gas and the apartment. They're going to keep raising the rents.
Katie eventually tells me why she believes these things. It's a gut feeling. This story is too fantastic for a guy like David Icke to have made up. It just explains too much.
These people's lives are destroyed by coming out with this. That's a good indication it's probably true.
At their core, these ideas aren't new. As long as there's been an internet, and even before, there's been people like Katie and David Icke and Alex Jones talking about the New World Order. It's a worldview that I don't share, that's widely accepted as untrue and harmful on several fronts. And yet, after we parted ways, there was something about our conversation that I couldn't shake. It wasn't about what Katie told me. The details didn't really matter. But I just felt like there was more to the story. I couldn't help myself. So I dove in.
That was an excerpt from Season 7 of the podcast Things That Go Boom, hosted by Lacey Healy. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Matteo Schimpf, Elise Manukian, and Andrew Stelzer. Our intern is Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.